Good morning, all. Feels like it's been a long time since we've been together here in this place. Last week, I was in Mexico City with my daughter to watch Sergio Perez race in front of his home crowd in the Mexican Grand Prix. Now, to be clear, she's straight tifosi, and you might need to look that up. That's capital T. She was there to cheer on Leclerc in his red Ferrari, but not me. Checo Perez is my guy, and he took third, which became the occasion for an indescribable street party for the 30 million locals in Mexico City, plus Taylor and I. And what a week we had. So I know you were in good care while you were here. Well, today we sit 2 weeks away from Advent. We're still sorting through the memories according to Mark as he recorded them, Mark the gospel writer. And as we prepare our hearts to make room again for the birth of God, we're marching up to Advent. We're just 2 weeks away now. Today, the lectionary directs our attention to the story right at the transition between Jesus' final activities in the city of David and something that scholars have come to call the Olivet Discourses. Meaning, of course, that this is the point where Jesus leaves the city for his own safety, and he takes up a position on an opposite hill, the Mount of Olives, to put the finishing touches on his teaching ministry with his disciples and his friends. And so let's read that passage. It's in Mark chapter 13, verse 1 through 8. Reading from the NRSV, it reads this way. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see those great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, now tweeting forward in time just a bit here, opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am here,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come." And finally, in verse 8, Jesus says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of birth pangs." And it's interesting to me that nation rising against nation and earthquakes in various places and famines, that's probably describes every day in human history since the beginning of time. Now, to review very, very briefly, Jesus rode into the city on the back of a donkey earlier in this same week, and we call that his triumphal entry. But whatever triumphal qualities this little bit of public theater had could only have been such in the eyes of poets and philosophers. Nothing very triumphal about riding into town on a donkey, you guys. And I said this a few weeks ago. Jesus was no prophet. He was also no priest. But even those who figured this out still hoped that maybe he would be a king. But given the way he rode into the holy city that day and that week, on an untrained beast of burden, fawned by crowds of children waving tree branches, any attentive observer, anyone who was paying attention, should have been able to ascertain that he was no king. At best, this was some kind of strange parody of kingship. Anyway, he managed to infuriate nearly everyone in the town by the end of week. It's such an interesting week. He flips some tables right after he stops off to see if a fig tree might help him with his groaning belly. We don't know everything that Jesus did this fateful week. Mark wrote down what he thought we needed to know, or all he could remember by the time he wrote at any rate. The cursing of a poor fig tree, some public questions of Jesus' authority, some significant rumbles around the subject of resurrection of the dead, and then we have Jesus and his little band of hopers heading back out of town. And this is the conversation we have preserved in our text today. Leaving town, disappointed, maybe even a bit shocked, almost certainly looking over their shoulders to see if they were being followed, the disciples point out the one thing they probably thought everyone, including Jesus, could still agree on: the beauty and the permanence of the temple. So Jesus, the wisdom teacher, finding ways to connect all things to whatever discourse he most wanted to have at that moment, juggled in the subject of the temple itself. No matter what the disciples throw at him, Jesus can juggle that too. And as per usual, the disciples think they're talking about one thing, one subject, but in subsequent conversations, it becomes crystal clear that Jesus is talking about something else entirely, which becomes clear to the reader in a subsequent conversation held in private. Now, Mark wasn't listed among the few people privy to that explanation, so I wonder how he knew these details. Anyway, There was a reason they were in the city that week, just like there was a good reason that they left when they did. Now here's what I imagine was going on behind the scenes. The circle of friends that followed Jesus around obviously had high hopes for his future, high hopes for his future, and high hopes for their role in it. Why else would they drop their trades and quit their day jobs to follow this guy? To matter, obviously. So a lot was riding on Jesus' performance in front of the crowds that week. And I'm guessing it hadn't gone as his friends had hoped, because they ended up leaving abruptly while the crowd wasn't looking, which wasn't the way to build a massive following. It was, in fact, the opposite of building a following. And we do what we do when we're disappointed or when we're upset, what we do when, our car has been chasing for 50 laps, suddenly pulls away and we can't catch what we're chasing, and there's nothing left in the pedal for us to keep up with what we hoped would happen. What do we do when that happens? Well, we pit or we punt. We change the subject, which often looks like reaching for a conversation about a subject we think everyone can agree on. I think I'm probably describing your Thanksgiving table most years. Do you do that? Do you reach back for something you think, well, at least we can agree on this? I know I do. The truth about the traveling school of discipleship that Jesus assembled and led was that the primary curriculum seemed to be an unbroken thread of major disappointments. So these folks, after a week's worth of letdowns as they're leaving town, bring up something they think everyone can agree on. I think that they make a nice effort here. It seems like a good attempt to lighten sort of the mood. This is, however, a very Jerusalem-specific conversation. It's a little too far away for us to fully get it. Think of it this way. If these folks were Austinites, the subject that they might bring up would probably be how good our food is or how much cooler our city is than Dallas or Houston, something that we all agree on here. But in Jerusalem, that one unrisky topic about which everyone could probably agree if you were Jewish was how beautiful and how permanent the temple was. It stood solidly at the center of everything. Surely Jesus couldn't disagree. I imagine them saying, "Hey Jesus, so we know you aren't going to stop causing trouble, picking fights, and rejecting the crowd's invitation to be their king. At least we can agree on how amazing our history is. I mean, look at this massive temple," they say. "Even if our present is weird and our future is uncertain, at least we can agree that our past was glorious." But they didn't get the reaction they were crossing their fingers for. So it demanded a clarifying conversation with Jesus later in private. The brave souls in the traveling entourage of this promising new voice on the wisdom scene had yet another major disappointment to sort through now. And as I said, I think in the world of Jesus, discipleship consisted of one disappointment after another. So the transitional conversation Jesus has with his followers leaving the city for the very last time as a free man was about the one untouchable thing at the center of it all, God's physical address on earth. Now, don't necessarily think of the temple as a church, my friends. This grand edifice was so much more than a place where folks would sip crappy coffee in styrofoam cups on weekends. No, this was the precise location where God and humanity were supposed to interact, overlap, engage, be in relationship. If this building were to be torn down, there would be nothing at the center of Jewish devotion. It wasn't easy being slaves to Rome. There was very little dignity and pride in paying monstrous tributes to fund the conquests of a maniacal emperor, but at least the Jews still had their temple. As long as that stood, hope remained, which is why this little conversation between Jesus and his friends matters so much. Imagine the shock. Jesus said some alarming things. He said them often, but this apocalyptic prediction pushed into brand new domains for his friends. He wasn't pruning the branches of their religious and national cosmology here. No, he was pulling on the very ancient root of the whole system. I think Jesus knew he would never survive this frontal assault on the temple. This would cost him his life. He was no fool, and he went there anyway. Now, maybe you grew up thinking that Jesus had to die because God was mad. Perhaps you were taught that God had to murder part of God's self so God could relearn how to love the rest of God's self. Maybe that narrative still works for you. It doesn't work for me anymore. I think people pay with their lives when they question the center of power and identity. Surely history's taught us this much. Now, this is bigger than just a discourse about the physical temple in Jerusalem, you see. It's about the physicality of the universe in general, about the nature of the cosmos and where God can be located in it. The center is moving. Or maybe a better way to say this would be human awareness of where God can always be found is evolving fast. Now think of it. The shocking claim beneath this discourse is simple, really, simple and astonishing. Jesus is claiming universal locatability of the divine. Anywhere bodies are, God is. Do you see that? Think that through all the way through and ask yourself this: what lies at the center now? Who gets to regulate access to God now? Now, admittedly, this is a big idea, one that takes time to germinate and bear fruit. All humans in all places from all cosmological systems would eventually discover the almost unbearable proximity of the divine spirit to the material world. But that would take most people thousands of generations to embrace. Jesus is pulling on these simple folks. He's pulling them forward quickly now. Now, to be clear, I'm leaning heavily on Paul's interpretation of this discourse of Jesus. Our passage only says Jesus announced the ensuing destruction of the actual temple, which actually was destroyed by the time Mark wrote this story. The traditional read on this is that Jesus was referring in some way indirectly to his body being raised again in 3 days. Imagine this message. Hey, don't hang on this building as the center of meaning, you guys. Forget the temple. It's no longer essential. God's new address is your body. Essentially, Jesus says, this will all fall and you will still be well. This will crumble like my broken physical body and still I will rise. All things do. It's how it actually all works. I wonder, can you feel the size of that shift? His friends didn't get it, but they weren't idiots. They were people of their time, not unlike us. And Jesus is proposing, after all, a whole new way of seeing the world. This is how he does, friends. He questions the center. He goes to the core. He calls our attention to the assumptions that we don't even think about. They're just there. They always have been. You know, it's interesting. I'm no expert on the intricacies of Jewish cosmology. I was raised as a Christian with a Jewish text, but being interpreted to me mostly by white Western Christian men, just like most of you. But I know something of the core assumptions behind the temple system. And it goes a little bit like this, if you were to summarize it. We humans are lost and broken and dirty and unreliable and evil to the core, so we need to cleanse and purify ourselves before approaching the presence of God, because God is ashamed of us, our choices, our nature, the urges and functions of our bodies, our proclivities, our world, so much so that God can't even look at us without being angry. Now, be honest, isn't that the basic stone upon stone algorithm that drives everything most of us ever knew about faith and religion? I'm certain there are dozens of ways to interpret and apply this story. I'm just choosing one that is revealing more of me to myself this week. You see, I used to think that everything was about punishment, that everything was personal, because I was irreparably damaged, and whatever was wrong between me and God and the world was naturally 100% my fault. The temple makes sense in that frame if the foundational assumption is original sin, and that God is angry at humanity, and that you need to have a pretty place to go and put him somewhere safe. You don't dare take home with you a God like this. He's way too dangerous. God as they knew him was not to be trifled with. But what are we to do if that new temple, that new place of encounter with God, that new location of the presence and vitality of the divine, what are we to do if that is now our own body? Oh, church, everything we ever knew is undone if that is true. The center of my approach to life and faith and relationships and spirituality and happiness and love is this idea. I have to work hard to be wanted because I'm unclean. I have to earn God's love and attention, and I have to keep it by being good and getting better, by believing and doing all the right things. That's what sits at the core. I wonder, does that sound familiar to you? Scary gods need stone temples. You mustn't get too close, unless that way of seeing the world is exactly what Jesus is trying to topple. Remind me, preacher, what was his final lesson before leaving the city of David? Oh, just that God was always as close as our own body. and that that's true for all people, and that it was never our job to alleviate God's anger. All things will fall, will rise again in time, bodies as well as buildings. This is the central claim of Jesus' message. Knock down these walls and altars and see what rises in their place. A decentered devotion, the awareness that God approves of people and meets them inside themselves wherever they are. Temples, bodies, they're not that dissimilar after all. The body is the stage where eternity and time now dance. The human body, with all her chaos and beauty, is the canvas upon which heaven and earth paint in vivid color, past, present, and future. If we still see Jesus as our exclusive claim, if he still belongs to our culture only, if we see him as proprietary to our religious cosmology, as our friend, as the hater of our enemies, then we lose here. He just moved the center. Our temple has fallen. Divine presence has always been universally acceptable, universally available. Now, today's message is just a moment frozen in time, but it's a big one. These simple folks like us were just trying to keep their place in his entourage, but it suddenly got significantly harder. There's no more sacrifices and burnt offerings, no more need for priests or religious professionals, no more obligation to do that work in Jerusalem, no more obsession with cleanliness and ceremonial purity. In fact, there is no more purity at all. It's all been decided. You are loved. You are fully seen and affirmed and welcomed here, right here. This is where there is only God now who can be found in your body. And if all that language feels culturally distant and arcane, try this. When we peel away the way we do worship and our missional thinking and our service to the poor, when we strip away our denominational identity, our leadership philosophy, and our commitment to justice, when all of it is burned to the ground and the core is revealed, if it is only about performance and anxiety and earning what we think we don't have access to because we are human and weak and addicted and confused, that, dear friends, is what needs to lie down and die now. There is only love. It's all been decided. There is only God who can be found right here in our bodies. This final thought. It's a terrifying thing to come to the natural end of one's ability to conjure God's blessings and approval. It's a terrifying thing to realize that you and God have always shared the same address. What falls away with the temple stones? Our crutch does. The complex system we used to rely on to gain what we've always had, God's love, acceptance, and affirmation. It's time to let go of all spiritual systems and religious technologies that feed our anxiety and sense of unworthiness. It's all been decided, dear ones. You might ask, well, then what holds the center now, preacher? What's at the middle? Well, just that your body is your way home, that your body is where God can be engaged, that God already lives comfortably there, if you can believe that. Oh, I pray that you will, dear friend. I pray that we all will. Be well.